is always on the mind of every markets reporter is the price. And last year at Davos, I had a conversation with Majid, and we were talking about what the price expectation for this year, or 2018, would be, and he said we'd see 80. What is your expectation today?
I'm not as brave to forecast it for the year. I think what we have seen clearly in the last few months is a lot of volatility, and I expect that will continue. If we look back on the concerns, obviously China, what's happening with China, trade deal, but also the economic situation. And then on the supply side, the growth that we've seen over the last year has been mainly US, Canada, Brazil to some extent, and Iraq. But really, if you look back, say back to 2012, 70% of the growth in supply has come from the US. So we're largely relying on US unconventional supply. And in fact, the last 3 years, conventional oil hasn't played a role in supply growth. Demand's gone up by 4 million barrels a day. We're over 100 million barrels a day for the first time. And all of that in the last 3 years came from the US. So there is chronic underinvestment in conventional oil. And then on the gas side, the growth in demand for gas, the huge developing economies like China and India recognizing it as a fuel of choice for power, not just for global climate change policy, but for local air quality policy. That's a huge political driver now with cities like Beijing and Delhi, and it's more than just a quality of life. They've had huge health challenges, even deaths as a result of air quality. So the switch from coal to gas, which economies like the US and the UK have already largely achieved, is going to be a big driver for gas demand growth, particularly in Asia.
I'm not hearing a price from you there, though.
I think what we need to see in the upstream sector to encourage more investment on the conventional side is a price band probably between $70 and $90, 95 maybe. I think north of 100 starts to become harmful for consumers. But at the levels we're at now, we're still seeing underinvestment. Probably this range of 60 to 80 is where we might be. A lot depends on the kind of central bank of the OPEC Plus deal continuing, which I expect it to, and I think it's surprised a lot of the naysayers over the last year, and the Saudi-Russian partnership there obviously has been key. The big unknown is all the concerns of global recession. Is it people just annoyed that interest rates are going up and their heady days in the stock market aren't going to continue, or is it a real threat? And that's something I think that oil markets are going to be watching closely over the coming weeks.
Well, one person sitting on this stage would have a pretty clear idea of how far those conversations really got. Majid, you've been working in Iraq for many years now. Give us your sense of how cooperative the new government is going to be to this kind of influence.
So I have no visibility on how those conversations went. But the situation in Iraq, there's clearly a lot of gas resources in country. But what hasn't yet happened is a strategy to utilize them. So you have the strange situation where over 1 billion cubic feet per day being flared in the south, and yet there are power stations, new-built gas-fired power stations, one by an affiliate of ours, further north in the country, in the center of the country, sitting idle, some of them on top of gas fields, and utilizing imported Iranian gas at quite a high price. So that, I think the Iraqi government recognizes that. Electricity provision is the #1 priority. Despite all the good news in Iraq in recent years, the defeating ISIS, the elections, the Kurdistan post-referendum issue, remaining peaceful, the big issue is service delivery. The main reason the government didn't get re-elected or continue was last summer's demonstrations over electricity, and particularly in the south. So they've been talking with Siemens, GE about national strategies, but also looking immediately how to deliver more electricity for the coming summer. We have bid successfully on 3 new blocks, 2 of them in the Diyala area, not far actually, 60 to 70 kilometers from our current production in the Kurdistan region, which is already 400 million cubic feet per day, and we plan to double that in the coming years. But then with these Diyala blocks, we could hopefully add to the domestic gas production, particularly in the areas where there's a deficit of gas. And then in the south, you have Shell, who's been working on gathering gas, associated gas. But as the oil production increases, of course, that associated gas production is also increasing. And there's huge investment requirements in the infrastructure.
That's a major problem for a lot of countries.
I have a one-word question for all 4 of you. China. Role in Iraq, Majid.
So I think in terms of energy markets overall, that's the one maybe most important driver over the medium term, is what is really happening with the Chinese economy. There have been several indicators in the last few weeks even that maybe the rate of growth is slowing down. Having said that, what we've seen, for example, with demand for LNG, liquefied natural gas, growth over the past year has just exceeded all the expectations. So it's going to remain a very important growth market for energy. In terms of its role here in the region, and Fred asked about Iraq, I mean, extremely active. And I'm very glad that the conference this year, the forum this year, has a particular focus on Asia and China. And I know there's a session on the One Belt, One Road initiative. And in Iraq, we've seen very active in the upstream companies, service companies, state and private sector, and a big capacity for financing also, and maybe more of an appetite for risk. I think through the ups and downs many countries in the region have had, and Iraq obviously was a central battlefield with the war on ISIS. Many of the Western majors left or reduced activity in certain parts of the country. We didn't see that actually with the Chinese companies. So I think they take a long-term view, and there's clearly a strategic driver for them to be active in this region and in energy in particular.
But
Sorry,
Majid,
I had
you
it.
can
No, there's a gentleman
Yeah,
there who
there's-
actually raised his hand first, but maybe with the lighting you couldn't see him.
One more then.
So.
Very energetically.
Thank you very much for the distinguished panelists. Slightly shifting from the geopolitics, this is Walid al-Somali from Saudi Aramco. R&D investments in the arena of energy is an extremely critical factor for this region for efficiencies in the energy domain. Latest European Union statistics, $2 trillion were spent 2018 by corporate in R&D. So my question is for the distinguished panelists, 2 brief questions. One, what it takes for multinational corporations operating in the energy arena to increase its investments in R&D technology developments here in the region. The other question is about technology-based entrepreneurship. The whole region is putting a lot of emphasis on entrepreneurship and embedding them, entrepreneurs, SMEs, startups, in the supply chain of energy. What can the energy industry, what strategies that can be considered in embedding entrepreneurship in its supply chain? Thank you.
So here in our region, I think clearly we're punching below our weight. We have half the world's oil and gas reserves, or probably more, but that's what's proven. Less than a third of its production, less than a sixth of gas production. And we've seen over recent years that other parts of the world, and North America in particular, have seen much more rapid growth. Now, we've had geopolitical issues, as you mentioned, many countries, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, and that clearly affects the oil and gas development. but there is underinvestment. And it's great to see what Dr. Sultan mentioned in terms of ADNOC looking at both cost efficiencies and new models for partnering with the private sector, because clearly the public sector can't be relied upon alone to take the burden of the investment, because there are national budget needs in all countries, and they are growing with populations which are growing. So how to encourage the private sector, and you mentioned multinationals, absolutely multinationals, but first our own regional private sector, and I say that as a member of it, can play, I think, a bigger role in all parts of the value chain. In terms of R&D, it's very important, but it starts with universities. We need universities with the right departments, science, technology, and more on the oil and gas side, because even the multinationals, when they come to make such R&D investments, they usually look to an institution of higher learning that has that capability. And I know Saudi Arabia has been a leader with many top universities in that field.